Imaging the Exotic Other, John Wesley and the People of Africa. The second half of the 17th and the first half of the 18th century were profoundly significant in the emergence of Western European self-consciousness. The voyages of discovery, exploitation, conquest, enslavement, and colonization brought Europeans into contact with diverse peoples with very different cultures. This contributed to the development of a sense of a common European identity in contrast to the exotic others. This emerging identity was spread amongst a broader public through the depiction of these encounters in various artistic creations and the narration in popular travel accounts, which were widely distributed across Europe. Thus, for example, a text we will consider later, by Peter Kolb, or Kolbe, or Kolben, various spellings are given, entitled The Present State of the Cape of Good Hope, was originally published in German in 1719, was translated and published in English in 1731. It had been previously published in Dutch in 1727 and was later published in French in 1743. This process of developing a common European identity was not merely ideological. The ideological dimensions and its related self-consciousness emerged in a dialectical relationship with the material exploitation, enslavement, and colonization of people beyond Europe. The material dynamics provided the point of encounter between the people of Europe and the exotic other, and the ideological construction of the European self, in contrast to the exotic other, legitimated enslavement, conquest, exploitation, and colonialism. An important component of this ideological construction was the development of a hierarchical concept of race, and in some cases a rejection of traditional Christian understandings of the unity of humanity as common descendants of Adam and Eve. John Wesley read travel narratives and used the images of the exotic other in various contrasting ways in his writings. This paper examines two sets of images that he used, those of the people of West Africa in his anti-slavery writings, and those he describes as the inhabitants of the Cape of Good Hope. The aim is to ask not only how does he image these others, but to place this in the context of his theology of the image of God, and of their rhetorical function in the particular writings. Thoughts upon Slavery provides one of his most detailed imaging of a particular cultural group outside of Europe. The references to the inhabitants of the Cape of Good Hope are less detailed and scattered in diverse writings. So firstly, imaging the people of West Africa. An important component of John Wesley's argument in Thoughts Upon Slavery is a depiction of the cultures and societies of West Africa. He contrasts these societies with the behavior of the European enslavers. As is well known, Wesley made extensive use of the writings of Anthony Benezet in his Thoughts Upon Slavery, and his depiction of West African societies are extracted from Benezet's Some Historical Account of Guinea. Benezet in turn took them from various travel narratives. Despite this complex process, Wesley emphasizes that his account is based on eyewitnesses and is thus reliable. Wesley's description portrays the people and societies of West Africa as characterized by the following. They were religious. He describes them either as Muslims or monotheistic African traditionalists. He notes that the Muslims abstained from alcohol as a consequence of their religion. Our society is characterized by justice. They are just and fair in their relationships and in their dealings with each other. They're societies where crime is appropriately punished. In particular, Wesley refers to murder, theft, adultery. They're compassionate societies. They cared for the poor and needy members of their communities. They are virtuous. The people were courteous, modest, industrious, respectful, hospitable, charitable, and friendly, and they were peaceful. War was avoided if possible, and individual and social conflicts were settled peacefully. He summarizes his description as follows, and I quote, Upon the whole, therefore, the Negroes who inhabit the coasts of Africa, from the river of Senegal to the northern bounds of Angola, are so far from being stupid, senseless, and brutish, lazy barbarians, the fierce, cruel, perfidious savages that they have been described, that on the contrary, they are represented by them who have no motive to flatter them, as remarkably sensible, considering the few advantages they have for improving their understanding, as industrious to the highest degree, as fair, just, and honest in all their dealings, unless where white men have taught them to be otherwise, and as far more mild, friendly, and kind to strangers than any of our forefathers were. Where shall we find this day among the fair-faced natives of Africa, a nation generally practicing justice, mercy, and truth, which are found among the poor Africans? Suppose the preceding accounts are true, which I see no reason or pretence to doubt of, and we may leave England and France to seek genuine honesty in Benin, Congo, or Angola." End quote. This summary highlights 4 important points in Wesley's imaging of the West African other. The first is that the positive ideal that Wesley used to evaluate the people of Africa is based on an idealization of what he considers to be the best virtues and values of European cultures. Second, he evaluates European societies and people positively in comparison to He evaluates African societies and people positively in comparison to European societies. While African societies may lack the technological and scientific development of European societies, they have the potential for that development and are morally superior to European societies. This moral superiority receives greater emphasis when he describes the horrific cruelties and injustices of slavery. He thus states, "Whites, not blacks, are without natural affections." The third feature is that the negative characteristics attributed to African people and societies are the consequence of intervention by Europeans. Thus, for example, the involvement of African societies in the enslavement of others and the associated warfare are a result of the actions of slave traders. The characteristics attributed to enslaved people that were deemed to demonstrate their inferiority were either a consequence of the deprivations and the cruelty of enslavement, or the legitimate acts of resistance against slavery. Fourthly, the positive images that Wesley describes, he claims are based on unbiased observation by people who have no interest in portraying them in this way. The negative images are produced by those who are prejudiced, who have a superficial knowledge of the people concerned, and or have an interest in justifying slavery by portraying Africans as inferior and barbaric. This emphasis on reliable eyewitness accounts as a source of truth conforms with Wesley's empiricism. This point is also made by Benezet in his Some Historical Account of Guinea. He uses as his prime example of the way African people have been maligned and denigrated by false reports the indigenous inhabitants of the Cape of Good Hope, whom he, in accordance with the usage of the time, designates as Hottentots, a name now recognized as derogatory and generally replaced by Khoi or Khoikhoi. Benezet's reference is significant in that the Khoikhoi were not subjects of the transatlantic slave trade, though they were cruelly treated by white settlers in the Cape. But they were widely used in Europe as prime examples of the depths of inferiority, barbarism, degradation, and otherness. Benezet refers to the work of Peter Kolb to show that the denigrating depiction of the Khoikhoi as the ultimate other by Europeans was based on ignorance and prejudiced misinformation. Secondly, imaging the inhabitants of the Cape of Good Hope. Wesley's references to the Khoikhoi, whom he designates as the inhabitants of the Cape of Good Hope, or Hottentots, are scattered in his writings. He uses an image of them in precisely the way that Benezet rejects, as an example of extreme barbarism and degradation. His most detailed portrayal is found in the Doctrine of Original Sin, As part of his description of the heathens of his own times, he refers to African people not influenced by Christianity or Islam, with the Khoikhoi as his prime example. It is thus not clear whether all his statements apply particularly to the Khoikhoi or more general references to African people. The key features of his imaging of them are as follows. They are ignorant of philosophy and science. They have no system of government. Their food, clothing, and houses are barbaric and disgusting, and refers here to the common assertion that the Khoikhoi use the entrails of sheep and cattle as clothing or as personal decoration. They have no knowledge of God. Their personal and their social lives are the opposites of the virtues of justice, mercy, and truth, and he compares the intellectual achievements and social organization to that of animals. It is not entirely clear what sources Wesley used for his information about the Khoikhoi, what the Khoikhoi were, and whether in some cases he merely reflected popular images. Randy Maddox suggests that John Maxwell's An Account of the Cape of Good Hope and William Dampier's Voyages Around the World are probable sources for the comments in the Doctrine of Original Sin. 20 years after writing the Doctrine of Original Sin, Wesley wrote a second, longer comment on the Khoikhoi in his sermon, The Imperfections of Human Knowledge, where he states, and I quote, "Who cares for those outcasts of men, the well-known Hottentots? It is true a later writer has taken much pains to represent them as respectable people. But from what motive? It is not easy to say, since he himself allows, a specimen of their elegance of manners, that the raw guts of sheep and other cattle are not only some of their choicest food, but also the ornaments of their arms and legs. And a specimen of their religion, that the son is not counted a man till he has beat his mother almost to death, and when his father grows old, he fastens him to a little hut and leaves him there to starve. O Father of mercies, are these the works of thy own hand, the purchase of thy son's blood?" End quote. In between the writings of the Doctrine of Original Sin and the Imperfections of Human Knowledge, Wesley had studied and used Benez's Some Historical Account of Guinea, with its reference to the Khoikhoi and Kolb's work. Albert Alter is almost certainly correct in his assertion that the late writer Wesley referred to is Kolb. The 1731 translation of The Present State of the Cape of Good Hope by Mr. Medley was a major source of information on the Khoikhoi, and Kolb explicitly set out to correct the popular misconceptions. Medley's translation is a somewhat problematic, shortened, edified and modified version of the German original. A further shortened and modified version was published in Thomas Astley's a new collection of voyages and travels of 1746. The later version was the source used by Anthony Benezet, and we cannot be entirely sure which of these Wesley read and used, or if he had gained his information from references to Kolb in other works. In addition to Kolb, Alter refers to Thomas Salmon's Modern History, Willem ten Reyns' An Account of the Cape of Good Hope, and the Hottentots, the natives of that country, as possible sources of Wesley's information. Both Salmon and ten Reyns refer to Kolb. While some of Wesley's descriptions in The Imperfections of Human Knowledge are based on statements found in Kolb, it is notable that they are not accurate references. Wesley continues to depict the Khoikhoi culture as embodying the depths of human depravity. His reference to the well-known Hottentots points to the way in which the Khoikhoi were depicted in popular British discourse as the epitome of primitive barbarism. Most devastating is the final sentence. O Father of mercies, are these the works of thy own hands, the purchase of thy son's blood? Wesley is unable to grasp the compatibility of Khoikhoi culture with their humanity. In doing so, he employs the same language that he uses in Thoughts Upon Slavery to affirm the humanity of enslaved Africans. He appears unaware that the Moravians had begun mission work among the Khoikhoi in 1737, the missionary George Schmidt, was expelled from the Cape by the Dutch authorities in 1742 due to his commitment to the universal atonement, that the Khoikhoi were indeed the purchase of Christ's blood. Wesley repeats his negative image in his sermon on conscience, where he describes the Khoikhoi as being ignorant of the principle and common to the rest of humanity of honouring one's parents. Wesley's image in the Khoikhoi displays the features of the accounts he and Benezet criticized in their anti-slavery arguments. It reinforced popular prejudices and questions the credibility and motives of Kolb's testimony. Wesley seems unable or unwilling to overcome his own prejudice and accept a more positive view. The third point: images of the divine other and images of the African other. Central to Wesley's theology is his affirmation that human beings were created in the image of God, and that salvation is the process of the restoration of that image. While important elements of Wesley's image of the African other While important elements of Wesley's imaging of the African as other is an idealization of aspects of the emerging European self-image, it can only be understood against the background of Wesley's theological narrative of human beings being created in the image of the divine other. However, it must be emphasized that the history of interpretations of what constitutes the image of God are deeply interrelated with developments in European culture and intellectual history, often merely reflecting these developments. The presupposition of Wesley's understanding of the image of God is that all human beings are descendants of Adam, in some sense children of God the Creator, and are thus siblings. In Wesley's theology of the image of God, the image has two dimensions. The first was the natural image, composed of understanding, will, affections, and liberty. For the purpose of this paper, the understanding is important. Wesley proposed that the unfallen Adam obtained true in-depth knowledge of reality by intuition and observation, and his reasoning processes were completely rational, so that what he thought was correct. As such, Adam had a vast but finite knowledge of the world. The second dimension was the moral image. Wesley describes this in a number of ways. Two are significant for this paper. The first was that the moral image consisted of love for God and one's fellow human beings. And second was that love for humanity is expressed in justice, mercy, and truth. The fall into sin destroyed the moral image of God. Human beings became centered on themselves, and thus take on the image of the devil, expressed in injustice, cruelty, and deceit. Being centered on themselves, they seek fulfillment in the creature rather than their creator, giving themselves to the self-centered satisfaction of their bodily desires. Wesley describes this as taking on the image of a beast. The lives of fallen human beings are permeated and dominated by sin, so that they cannot practice justice, mercy, and truth. The natural image is severely distorted and corrupted, resulting in confusion, error, ignorance, and irrationality in our knowledge of the world. However, no human being exists in the fallen state, because God intervenes in the lives of all people in prevenient grace, countering the effects of sin and enabling human beings in a limited way to practice justice, mercy, and truth. Prevenient grace is not a universal upgrade of all human beings, but a dynamic, interactive engagement between the Spirit of God and the human being. As a result, different people, and hence different human cultures and societies, will display different expressions of justice, mercy, and truth. As a result of prevenient grace, it is possible for all humans to respond to God. Wesley argued that people who had never heard the gospel could experience heathen faith. Believing that God exists, they could fear God and act righteously. Such people are accepted by God. The process of sanctification, beginning at the new birth and reaching a new intensity through Christian perfection, is the process of the ever fuller restoration of the image of God. This is also a dynamic, interactive process and is expressed in various ways. This process of personal transformation impacts the broader society in which Christians live, leading to cultural and social transformation. However, given that not all people who lived in Christianized societies had experienced the new birth, that many were only Christian in name, and even those who experienced the new birth were still subject to error, misunderstanding, confusion, and the possibility of moral failures, such societies may also be characterized by injustice, cruelty, and deceit. Wesley's understanding of the social and cultural development is complex. A society or cultural group is a product of a multifaceted and dynamic interaction of diverse factors. In relation to moral development, it is an interaction between the dynamics of the creation and image of God, the persistent presence of sin, the pervasive presence of prevenient grace, and in some cases, the specific presence of regenerating and sanctifying grace. A given society can be viewed from one or more of these perspectives, leading to different depictions. Wesley's images of the people of West Africa are from the perspective of prevenient grace, and thus their lives and cultures display a partial restoration of the moral image of God. However, he images the people of the Cape of Good Hope from the perspective of the persistence of sin, and hence as expressing the image of the devil and a beast. Wesley held a broadly progressivist view of human societies, with some societies displaying greater levels of social, cultural, and scientific progress than others. The fourth point, the African other in Wesley's rhetoric. The way Wesley images the people of Africa has particular rhetorical function in his theology. This function needs to be understood if these images are to be critiqued and transcended by Wesley's theological descendants. Wesley claims to place a high value on empirical evidence and the testimonies of eyewitnesses. However, he is highly selective in the information that he draws from his sources. His rhetorical purpose and his theological presuppositions shape his selection, determining what he includes and what he excludes. This can be seen by comparing Wesley's thoughts upon slavery with Benezet's Some Historical Account of Guinea. While Wesley provided a shorter, more coherent argument While Wesley's goal to provide a shorter, more coherent argument required selection, it is worth noting what he left out. A few examples will suffice. Benezet refers to African societies where slavery was practiced as a punishment or where people from other groups were enslaved. Wesley does not include these references. Wesley portrays West African religions as monotheistic in either an Islamic or African traditionalist form, and does not include Benezet's reference to polytheistic worship, nor to the conversion of some Africans to Roman Catholic Christianity. Referring to the inhabitants of the Grain and Ivory Coast, Benezet states, and I quote, "These are represented by some writers as a rude, treacherous people, whilst other authors represent them as sensible, courteous, and the fairest traders on the coast of Guinea." End quote. Wesley only includes the second part, with its positive evaluation. Referring to the Kingdom of Benin, Benezet states, and I quote, "Theft, murder, and adultery were being severely punished." End quote. Wesley wrote, "Theft is punished among them, although not with the same severity as murder." End quote. Determining Wesley's selectivity with regard to his image of the Khoikhoi is more complex, given that it is not always clear what his sources were. His comments in The Imperfections of Human Knowledge provide the clearest indication of its selectivity and its distorting consequences when compared with Kolb's work. In contrast to the derogatory image from popular culture, largely repeated by Wesley. Kolb's image of the Khoikhoi emphasized the reasonableness of Khoikhoi cultural practices, portrayed resemblances between Khoikhoi and European culture, and described some Khoikhoi religious customs as similar to Jewish ones, proposing that they must in part derive from traditions that go back to Noah. Kolb's observations contradicted virtually every aspect of Wesley's portrayal of the Khoikhoi in the Doctrine of Original Sin. It might be assumed that Wesley was not aware of Kolb's work when he wrote that description. However, in the imperfections of human knowledge, Wesley disparaged Kolb's motives, despite the spiritual affinity between Kolb and Wesley. Kolb was deeply influenced by German pietism. He had corresponded with August Hermann Frank about the publication of his work on the Cape of Good Hope. Wesley ignores the positive elements of the Khoikhoi culture that Kolb describes, many of which describe the same positive features that Wesley refers to in West African cultures in Thoughts Upon Slavery. Rather, he focuses on three negative aspects of Khoikhoi culture. First, he repeats and ascribes to Kolb the popular view that the Khoikhoi ate raw guts and used them for personal declaration and clothing. Kolb explicitly rejected this, noting that while the Khoi ate the intestines, they first cleaned and cooked them. He described that the decorations worn by women on their legs were not guts, but dried leather. Kolb did note that intestines were sometimes used in a particular religious context as decoration. Wesley's reference to his son not being counted a man until he was beaten, he has, and I quote, beaten his mother almost to death, end quote, is based on Kolb's description of a coming-of-age process, where boys who had previously been totally under the care of their mother had to explicitly separate themselves from their mothers. In cases where a boy was accused of not doing so, the boy responded by acting violently towards his mother to prove his separation. From Kolb's description, this was not a universal practice required of all boys. Wesley's horror at this might have been intensified by his own deep attachment to his mother. Wesley's description of a son fastening his old father to a hut and leaving him to starve refers to Kolb's description of a practice whereby old and sick members of the community were given a supply of food and then confined to a hut to let them die. The point here is not to ethically justify the practices described by Kolb, leaving aside the questions of the accuracy of Kolb's reporting, but to note how Wesley's description intensified the negative in ways to arouse outrage and disgust. In Wesley's imaging of West Africans, he selects his material to portray a positive image that conforms to his theological understanding of a people under the dispensation of the heathen, who have positively responded to prevenient grace. Data in his sources that does not conform to this image is ignored. His imaging of the Khoi also occurs through a selection of data, but in this case it is data that conforms to his image of pervasive human depravity in bondage to sin. Data in his sources that does not conform to this image is not selected. By comparing his sources, it can be seen that the descriptions of the Khoi that portray them in a way that is closer to Wesley's images of West Africans, that they are just, merciful and honest, are not included by Wesley. The images of the exotic other have been filtered through the categories of Wesley's theology to create distorted images which fit his theological and rhetorical purposes. There is no genuine encounter with the African people in their unique particularities that would disturb Wesley's theological and rhetorical categories. The positive imaging of the people of West Africa has four important rhetorical functions in Wesley's argument against slavery. The first is to discredit the argument used by the proponents of slavery that justified the enslavement of Africans on the grounds that Africans were barbarous savages who engaged in constant warfare and the enslavement of others. Enslavement by Europeans was, in this legitimation, not a significant deterioration in the lives of African people. It was a continuation of what was normal, and if anything, it improved their lives by bringing them into European civilization. Second, the emphasis on the morality and monotheistic religion of the Africans countered the argument that enslaved people benefited from slavery because it brought them into contact with the gospel, and thus with the prospect of eternal salvation. Wesley taught that God accepted all those who feared God and did righteousness. Third, it served to portray what the enslavers portrayed as negative characteristics of enslaved people as consequences of their enslavement and not a consequence of their race. Fourthly, Wesley draws explicit contrast between the behavior of the enslavers and the behavior of the people of West Africa. This contrast has two important dimensions. The first is theological. African societies displayed morality, justice, mercy, and truthfulness, while the behaviors of the enslavers was immoral, unjust, cruel, and deceitful. The non-Christian African people thus manifested the image of God, while the European enslavers, despite the professions of Christianity, manifested the image of the devil and the beast. The second relates to the images of the exotic other that dominated European literature and art at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. These portrayed the exotic others as violent and cruel and sexually promiscuous. Wesley portrays them as peaceful and compassionate, with strict sexual morality, seen in their punishment of adultery. The enslavers engaged in violent slave raids and wars, treated enslaved people with great cruelty, and engaged in sexual abuse of enslaved people, stripping them naked and breaking up their marriages. It was the Europeans who were the barbarous savages, and not the Africans. Thus, the positive image of the West Africans functions rhetorically to delegitimize the images of European superiority, to shame those involved in enslaving Africans. It does this by imaging Africans in the light of the partial restoration of the image of the divine other through prevenient grace. However, this is done by imaging them in a way which correlates with the ideals of Christianized European culture, thus distorting African identity. A distortion that is intensified by Wesley's highly selective use of data. The images of the Khoikhoi people in Wesley's writings have two major rhetorical functions. The first is to legitimate his doctrine of original sin, by portraying the Khoikhoi as a prime example of the depth of depravity that it is possible for human beings to fall to. The second is as a point of comparison directed towards Wesley's British audience, to argue that the British audience are as depraved as those who were considered, in popular culture, to be the most depraved cultural group. This again is an attempt to shame Europeans, but in contrast to thoughts upon slavery, it is by using an extremely negative image of an African cultural group. Both these rhetorical functions image the Khoikhoi to reflect the fall of humanity from the image of God to the image of the beast, as directed towards Wesley's proclamation of the gospel to British people. It is notable that Wesley's negative imaging of the Khoikhoi does not function as a motive for mission to them, and he gives no evidence of concern for the abuse that the Khoikhoi suffered at the hands of European colonial invaders. The result is a devastating and denigrating distortion of the identity of the Khoikhoi. In conclusion, John Wesley has been rightly praised for his principled theological opposition to slavery in a context where this would have been neither popular nor beneficial to himself or his movement. His opposition was deeply rooted in the core commitments of his theology to the value of all human beings as creatures and as children of God, that human beings are called to love their neighbours, that is, all human beings, to self-sacrificially work for their well-being. However, this must not obscure the deeply problematic way in which he imaged the people of Africa, even when he was engaged in seeking to end the genocidal slave trade. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Wesley held that all human beings were siblings, children of God and children of Adam. Hence, all human beings, regardless of ethnicity, had the same potential for good and for evil, for intellectual, scientific, and cultural achievement, and that God's grace could transform all who respond to this. Given his optimism, he would not have been surprised that there are now flourishing Methodist churches amongst the descendants of the Khoikhoi people, whom he regarded as epitomizing depravity. However, when taking into account the limitations of historical context, Wesley's imaging of the people of However, even when taking into account the limitations of historical context, Wesley's imaging of the people of Africa is, in Wesley's words, violates his own standards of treating people with justice, mercy, and truth, and in honoring them as being made in the image of God, bought by his Son, and designated for his kingdom. At best, it can be understood as an example of invincible prejudice that he described in his sermon in the Catholic Spirit, and I quote, "Although every man necessarily believes that every particular opinion which he holds is true, yet no one can be assured that all his own opinions taken together are true. Nay, every thinking man is assured that they are not. To be ignorant of many things and to mistake in some is a necessary condition of humanity. This, therefore, he is sensible, is his own case. He knows in general that he himself is mistaken, though in what particulars he is mistaken, he does not. Perhaps he cannot know. I say, perhaps he cannot know, for who can tell how far invincible ignorance may extend, or what comes to the same thing, invincible prejudice, which is often so fixed in the tender minds that it is afterwards impossible to tear up what has taken so deep a root. And who can say, unless he knew every circumstance attending it, how far any mistake is culpable? Seeing all guilt must oppose some concurrence to the will, of which he only can judge who searcheth the heart." Thank you.